Okay, hello sophomores. We're going to go through the content notes for Chapter 25. This is on Cold War America. We had started talking about some of this material already in class, but we're going to go through Chapter 25 notes here, so those of you who like to rely on the lecture, let's get to it. Here we go. Preview slide, we talked a little bit about the other day, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, the Berlin Airlift. Some of these concepts and ideas and events already came through in the short clips we watched in class. So these are the things that I've pulled out. You want to pay attention to these as you go through your material, as you read Chapter 25 in your reading guide. Make sure you know what they are, you're able to identify them, but more importantly, you're able to explain intelligently how they fit into the context of the Cold War and U.S. containment policy. Okay. I also pulled out some of the outline material from the College Board content outline. The first thing we're going to look at here in the content slides is how the economy was changing after 1945. So you notice on this slide, you want to be able to explain the causes and the effects of the migration that took place among various groups of Americans after 1945. So we had a lot more higher education opportunities, meaning more people are going to college. Technology is changing. There's a lot of social mobility. A lot of people are going from point A to point B. And then a new place in the country that's emerging known as the Sun Belt, which is the southwestern part of the United States that's emerging as a political and economic force. All right. So the post-war economy, the fear was after World War II is that the economy would collapse, believe it or not. Would the GIs returning home find jobs? Would jobs be available to them? People were afraid that the Great Depression might return again. The government answered by passing the GI Bill of Rights. We talked about this a little in class the other day. This would help veterans and anybody for that matter, but namely veterans by providing tuition for them, tuition assistance for school, and low-interest government loans. This is one of the ways that veterans were able to start a career or go to college if they wanted to after they returned from the war. And this fed a tremendous economic boom that occurred during the late 40s and 50s and onward. We saw that in the video we watched, the Best Years video. After World War II, the U.S. is by far the richest country in the world. We're the most powerful country militarily and also economically, and the middle class grew by over 50%. Defense spending is a primary reason for this economic prosperity because we know the Cold War now has begun. And so a lot of defense spending is being fed into the economy, and that's leading to a lot of job creation. Much of the growth, like I mentioned earlier, takes place in this new part of the country known as the Sun Belt, which is the southern, southwestern part of the United States. And Americans now are moving to this new place called Suburbia America, or they're building homes in the suburbs. And we see suburbs being built, the first of which being in upstate New York known as Levittown. The baby boom, this huge increase in babies being born, this population increase, demographic change in the United States is also feeding this economic boom. And the baby boom population, known as baby boomers, would have a huge impact on the American economy by the 60s and 70s. And they still are today by now retiring. This is the generation, the baby boomers are now retiring and have been for a number of years. President Truman is in office. So Truman actually had a very tough time politically. He was the first president of the 20th century to use the presidential powers to actually challenge racial discrimination. He attempted to get civil rights legislation through Congress unsuccessfully, but he did establish the Committee on Civil Rights in 1946. And he was the president by which the armed forces were ultimately desegregated by 1947. He vetoed what was known as the Taft-Hartley Act, but it was overridden by the Republican-controlled Congress. And this essentially was an act that put kind of squashed labor rights. It really it really slowed all the gains that the labor movement had made up until 1946 and 7. It made closed shops illegal. And Republicans at this time wanted to reduce the growing power of unions. So think of the Taft-Hartley Act. It was a bill that was designed to put a stop or to at least prevent any more gains made by the labor movement. Truman vetoed it, but Congress overrode his veto. So going to the election of 1948, the Democratic Party was actually quite divided. There was a faction known as the Liberal Democrats. They supported their candidate, Henry Wallace. And then you had Southern Democrats, known as Dixiecrats, support a man named Strom Thurmond. And then you had the other wing of the Democratic Party who nominated Harry Truman. Most political analysts picked Truman to lose the election. In fact, he was losing as late as just a few days before. But the strange thing is that when Truman went to bed that night, thinking he had lost the election, he ended up actually waking up the next day winning the election. And you can see the famous photo of him here showing the newspapers where it actually said Dewey defeating Truman. Dewey was the Republican candidate, but we know that Truman actually ended up winning that election. He proposed his first year or so, less than a year of his administration, what was known as the Fair Deal. That was his domestic reform program, which he essentially was calling on extending the programs and the progress that was made with FDR's New Deal. So just kind of a quick overview. He wanted to extend Social Security benefits. He wanted to increase the minimum wage. And like I said earlier, he wanted to and did propose the idea of national health insurance. This was kind of the first of its kind. Some of these things did get passed, some of them did not. So in some ways, it was much like the New Deal. Your book goes into further detail on what the Fair Deal also encompassed. Conservatives, the Republican Congress, blocked most of his Fair Deal proposals. You see in the cartoon here, the Truman and the Republicans going back and forth. Especially Southern Democrats would prevent him from passing many of his new Fair Deal programs. The exception was an increase in the minimum wage. There was an increase in the minimum wage from 40 cents to 75 cents an hour, which was a decent amount of money in 1947-48 when Truman began his second term. So that by and large was the economy, what that's looking like the first couple of years of Truman's administration. Most of Chapter 25, however, focuses on the Cold War, the early Cold War years, specifically 1945 to 1960. All right, so one of the things you want to do here, again, this is from the College Board outline, is be able to explain the continuities and changes in Cold War policies from 1945, it says, to 1980. And you can notice here some of the developments that are taking place, right? Policymakers are engaged in this Cold War against the authoritarian Soviet Union, trying to limit the growth and impact, the influence of communism. We know that it was a power struggle between the Soviet Union and the United States militarily, economically, ideologically as well. It was a contest essentially to see whose, let's say, government system was better, which economic system was better. Post-war tensions dissolved, right? The wartime alliance, remember these two sides, two countries were allies during World War II. And now the United States foreign policy has completely shifted from that of more isolationist, kind of go on your own, which the way it was after World War I, to more of one of collective security, international aid, being part of economic institutions, right, that would help fight communism. So let's get to some of the slides here. The way America looked in the post-war world, like I said, unlike after World War I, the U.S. would play a key role in World War II affairs. We are no longer isolationist. For example, taking a look at the eagle, he's looking right at you now. The U.S. joins the United Nations in 1945. Of course, we were one of the founding members. We are a member of the UN Security Council, along with Great Britain, China, France, and Russia. We would enter international finance agreements. We talked about some of these in class. For example, the Bretton Woods Conference would establish a global, stable economy. The International Monetary Fund was founded. The World Bank was founded. These are all institutions, economic, financial institutions that were founded in large part by the United States and its Western allies to help rebuild war-torn Europe and to promote international trade. The Soviets, on the other hand, would view these institutions as tools or almost weapons that were used to promote capitalism, and they rejected the invitation to become members of these financial institutions. So the Cold War begins. One could argue that it actually began even before World War II was over. But the Cold War largely begins by 1945, 1946, We said there was an ideological, political, and military struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. All right, and that would last for the better part of around 45 years. So even prior to 45, like I said, tensions existed between the two sides. There was ideological conflict between our two economic systems. President Wilson supported the White Army, which attempted to stop Lenin and the Bolsheviks from taking over during the Russian Revolution in 1917. The United States didn't even recognize the Soviet Union until President Roosevelt was in office in 1933. We knew that Stalin was a brutal dictator. We know that he signed that non-aggression pact with Hitler in 1939, and we never really envisioned ourselves becoming an ally, certainly, with the communist dictator Joseph Stalin. There were even tensions during World War II. Stalin was very angry and upset over the delays of opening that second front in the West. Right? He was wondering why this delay before D-Day happened. That would not happen until 1944. So there was an element of mistrust there. The Soviets were not included at all in the development of the atomic bomb. They were only notified after the successful bomb dropping in July of 1945, just weeks before we used it on Japan. So the big three would meet at Yalta in early 1945 to discuss their post-war vision. FDR and Churchill at Yalta think that Stalin agrees to representative governments to take place in Europe. FDR wanted to get Stalin to agree to help out in the war against Japan. Now, the idea of the bomb, that has not been tested yet, so none of the leaders are aware that the atomic bomb is still being tested at this point. So the fear was that the Allies would have to invade Japan to defeat them. Right? There's no atomic bomb yet in February of 1945. Stalin wants a buffer zone in Eastern Europe. This was one of the huge demands that he was making, that these countries, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia, these countries here would serve as a buffer, because the last thing he wanted was a Germany to invade the Soviet Union again like Hitler did in 1941. The Soviets had suffered greatly at the hands of Germany. Nearly half of the deaths in World War II came from Russia. And Stalin refused to remove the Soviet army from Eastern Europe, and he actually would go on to rig elections that would bring pro-Soviet governments into power in those countries that I showed you earlier. So there was already a great element of mistrust between the two sides even before the war was over. There in those countries, there would be pro-Soviet puppet governments that were sympathetic to Moscow in the name of preserving Soviet security. And that was the buffer zone that Stalin wanted that I alluded to earlier. So the fate of Europe really was at stake here, right? And that was our response to that was the containment policy. Here you see, we talked about this in class, Winston Churchill visiting Missouri. He was President Truman's guest in 1946, where he gave his famous Iron Curtain speech, where he said that an Iron Curtain, and you can see the Iron Curtain, this imaginary line, he said, that had fallen over the face of Europe, had ascended across the continent. Truman wanted Western democratic countries to stop Soviet's expansion altogether. He called for it in his speech. We talked about George Kennan in class. He was the ambassador to Russia who first used the word containment and called on the United States to adopt a containment policy. He did so in his long telegram that he sent from Moscow back to Washington, D.C. in 1946. Kennan said that the United States should work to stop Soviet expansion. We were not going to defeat it. And the containment policy would guide U.S. policy throughout the entire Cold War, all the way up to its ending in 1990. So the containment policy in action first took place in Greece and Turkey. Both countries there were under Soviet pressure. President Truman called on Congress to send $400 million to Greece and Turkey for fear that those countries would fall to communism. Truman did not send troops, and as a result of the economic hardships that were facing Europe in 46 and 47, fear that communism may be voted into power in Western Europe, like France and Italy. This was one of the main reasons why we decided to help these countries and to rebuild Europe. I mentioned this in class. that economic aid to these countries, we believe that poverty and economic hardship, these countries would be susceptible to communism, much like Greece and Turkey would be. So the European Recovery Program, also known as the Marshall Plan, was adopted, and this provided billions and billions of dollars to help aid Europe and to help rebuild Europe after the war was over, with the purpose of stopping communism from spreading by the use of economic aid. Western Europe was able to rapidly rebuild, and communism did not spread into the Western European countries here, namely France, Great Britain, but also these countries that were on the western side of this imaginary Iron Curtain line. We did extend Marshall Plan aid to the Soviet Union, but Stalin declined that aid. The first crisis of the Cold War took place in the late 1940s, and that was in Germany and Berlin. So following World War II, Germany was divided and controlled by the four victor powers of World War II, the United States, England, France, and the Soviet Union, and it was divided up into these four zones. Berlin was also divided up into four zones, with each victor of World War II occupying a zone. Notice the problem is going to be where Berlin is located. Berlin is located in the Soviet zone. So this western half, which was democratic, is actually basically becomes an island, sitting and surrounded by the communist Soviet zone of Germany. Stalin continued and wanted to weaken Germany for fear that Germany would rise up again, and wanted them to pay reparations, much like we forced them to do after World War I. And they start to form the German Democratic State, which eventually would become East Germany. The Soviet zone here would eventually become East Germany. So in June of 1948, Stalin decides to place a blockade around Berlin, which would prevent any goods or aid or supplies from coming into the citizens of West Berlin. Because remember, this part over here is all communist, right? It's communist Germany. Truman does not want to back down. We saw this in the video the other day we watched. He said, "We stay in Berlin for fear that we would look weak." He recalls the appeasement policy that was used with Hitler before World War II, and we know how that ended up. So we couldn't drive stuff in, so instead of leaving Berlin, we fly stuff in, known as the Berlin Airlift. This would provide the city of Berlin with supplies for about a year until Stalin would remove the blockade in May of 1949. Germany would remain divided. It was renamed, the western half, the western sector was renamed the Federal Republic of Germany. So by 1949 and 50, there are no more zones, but we rather have West Germany, and we now have the German Democratic Republic, also known as East Germany. And it would remain that way until 1989, when the Cold War was ended. Also keep in mind, Berlin is also divided between West Berlin and East Berlin. The military buildup continues. The United States joins NATO. NATO was founded. It was known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was a military alliance founded by the United States and the Western European allies. It was an act of collective security and also a way to contain communism throughout Europe. The National Security Act was passed in the United States. This established our current Defense Department, our current National Security Council. The CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, was founded. The arms race begins, right? Remember, the United States has dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan. By 1949, the Soviets also gain and successfully test their atomic bomb. So now the arms race is on to see who can develop the most powerful weapons. 1950 is the official document. We saw this in class, National Security Council 68, which calls for a military buildup. It's also the document that establishes the containment policy as the official policy of the United States when dealing with communism. It was implemented during the Korean War, which began in 1950. By 1952, the United States would test its first successful hydrogen bomb, which makes the atomic bomb look like a pin dropping in an ocean. The hydrogen bomb was extremely powerful, and it would only be a few years after this where the Russians successfully tested their hydrogen bomb as well. So the Cold War begins in Europe, but it actually also spreads to Asia. China would fall to communism in 1950 when the civil war between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong finally ended, and there were two Chinas essentially that were established. And what I mean by that is Mao Zedong in 1949 declares mainland China to be a communist country. It's also known as the People's Republic of China. It still is to this day. The nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, flee mainland China to what we know today as Taiwan. At the time, it was known as Formosa, but the island of Taiwan is where the nationalists fled, and it's still a very contentious issue today in politics and Chinese and American relations. The Republicans at the time blamed Truman for the loss of China to communism. They blamed the Democrats for China falling to communism, and it contributes the fall of China. It contributes to this growing domestic fear that communism is spreading here and reaching here to the United States and infiltrating American society. That, along with the Soviets getting the A-bomb in 1949, you can see maybe how people thought this way. So this brings on the second Red Scare here in the United States. Make sure you're able to explain the causes and effects of the second Red Scare after World War II. And you can see here some of the developments. Americans started to debate the policies, the methods that were designed to expose what people believed were suspected communists within the United States, whether they were part of political parties, part of the movie industry, part of the media, part of the U.S. government. And they viewed this in the larger containment policy. You heard in the video, do not confuse containment with the second Red Scare. The second Red Scare was the witch hunt, the policies, the investigations that took place here at home to try and expose suspected communists. Containment pertained to and was containment was the word, remember, used to describe how we were containing communism abroad from spreading to other countries. So the second Red Scare, like I said, was this widespread fear that communist influence would infiltrate American life. So Congress passed the Smith Act in 1940, made it illegal to belong to an organization that advocated the overthrow of the U.S. government by force. What you want to remember, in 1947, Congress created the federal agency, the program known as the Federal Employee Loyalty Program. And this gave the federal government the power to investigate the background of any federal employee. And eventually, Congress created their own subcommittee known as HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee. And this restarted, actually. This existed before World War II, but it was created again. It was given new life to search for communist influence in American life. Okay. A couple of the major players that were part of HUAC and were asked to testify in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee was Alger Hiss. The Alger Hiss case is kind of a test case study of the second Red Scare. He was a member of the State Department, and he was accused of being a communist by Whittaker Chambers in 1948. And during the HUAC hearings, Congressman Richard Nixon, that's future President Richard Nixon, would really make a name for himself. Hiss lied under oath. He was convicted of perjury, and he was ultimately sent to jail. But this kind of fed the idea, that maybe there were communists within our government, right? Are there other communists within the federal government? If Alger Hiss was a member of the State Department, maybe there are more. What fed even more fear to the public is what happened to Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. A couple in New York City, they were convicted of espionage for selling nuclear secrets to the Russians in 1951. Ultimately, they were executed. And then this set the stage for U.S. Senator Joseph McCarthy, okay, and McCarthyism. And you read about McCarthyism in your book, but Senator Joseph McCarthy was a senator who made a name for himself by playing on and feeding on the fears of this fear of communism spreading throughout the United States, by calling people to testify to the U.S. Senate, asking them to name names, asking them questions like, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? Do you know anyone being members of the Communist Party? It was questions like this, when a lot of what he did was just grounded in lies and like I said, playing on people's fears. So Eisenhower then by 1952 was the Republican candidate for president. His campaign slogan was "I like Ike," and he was a moderate Republican, eventually elected in 1952. He, along with Richard Nixon, his vice presidential candidate, took office in 1952, and Nixon was a hardcore anti-communist, right? He was the man who would lead one of the leaders of the HUAC hearings back in the 40s. Eisenhower was a political moderate. His stance was seen as acceptance of many of the New Deal programs. So even though Eisenhower was a Republican, he was a moderate Republican. He accepted a lot of the FDR Democratic New Deal programs of the 40s. And his largest public works project that he adopted was the Interstate Highway Act in 1956. We talked about this in class, how the interstate highway system was built not just for transportation and infrastructure, but it was also built for national security reasons. 42,000 miles of interstate highways were built, and the government justified it as a necessity to maintain national defense and national security. It created millions of jobs. We saw growth in the suburbs. Places like McDonald's started to pop up around the highways, and it created a country that was more homogeneous, right? It was more linked together, more similar across the country, because now these interstates, you can see on the map, go from east to west, north and south. We also see during this time the Korean War beginning. Following World War II, Korea was divided at the 38th parallel. This is the 38th parallel line that divided north from south. The North Koreans were led by the Soviet Union, so it was communist-based, and the South was occupied by the United States at the end of World War II, and that was a democratic country. By 1949, both countries decided to withdraw their troops, and by 1950, once that took place, the North Koreans invaded the South, hoping to unify the country under one communist government. So in order to contain communism, this was the first test case of the Cold War where troops would actually be introduced on the ground. The United States, along with the help of the United Nations, comes to the defense of South Korea because we view this as a Cold War proxy battle, right? And for the first year, the war would go back and forth. The North would invade. We come to the aid of South Korea. They make it as far as Busan in extreme southern South Korea. And then the South Koreans, along with the help of the United States at Incheon, push the North Koreans back almost to the border with China, which is what we were always afraid of. And you can see here, this was the first set of events within the first few weeks, 1950. They go as far as Busan. Douglas MacArthur and the United States with UN troops landed in Incheon, pushed the North Koreans back to as far as almost the Chinese border, but not quite. And then finally, the Chinese send about 100,000 troops into North Korea. And this is what causes ultimately a stalemate within South Korea. And ultimately, the Korean War would end with the dividing line still intact to this day. Okay, at the 38th parallel line. MacArthur, during the course of the war, called for expanding the war. He wanted to use nuclear weapons to try and end the war. In fact, he wanted to take the war all the way into China. Truman said no. Truman was more for a limited war, not to involve the Chinese. And MacArthur publicly criticized Truman's stance on the war, and Truman fired MacArthur. He was the popular World War II general. He was a World War II hero, but Truman fired him. Eventually, an armistice was reached in 1953. President Eisenhower visited Korea, and the Korean War ended in an armistice. And Korea to this day is still divided at the 38th parallel. So the question then becomes, did our containment policy work? One of the goals of this war was to stop the spread of communism. So in that light, I suppose you could say the containment policy was a success. Critics were hard on Truman. They charged that we were soft on communism, that the Democrats were soft on communism, and the United States also increased defense spending throughout the war and into the 1950s. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go skip these slides because these are more for Chapter 26, so I apologize for the fast forward. The Cold War would continue in 1950, throughout the 1950s after the Cold War was over. The Secretary of State under President Eisenhower, John Foster Dulles, talks about things called brinkmanship. In other words, we were not going to defeat communism. We are going to roll back any of the communist gains. But the look of containment under President Eisenhower was a little bit different than it was under President Truman. Eisenhower had what was called the New Look policy. We were going to build up our nuclear weapons as much as we possibly can, pushing the communists right to the brink of war, but not crossing the line. So we're going to deter communist aggression that way. The idea was with Eisenhower is that by building up our nuclear forces, we get more bang for our buck. In other words, they're more worth it than conventional forces. Okay? The threat of massive retaliation, the threat of destroying each other and possibly the world, would keep the two superpowers from fighting one another directly. And that's the strange thing about nuclear war during the Cold War, was the idea that both countries could destroy each other and the world would be enough to prevent each country from going to war with the other. Okay? So there was actually more rhetoric, more tough talk than action between the two superpowers. So by 1953, like I said earlier, Eisenhower would help end the Korean War by going to Korea, negotiating the armistice, and dividing North and South Korea to this day at the 38th parallel line. By 1956, Hungary would also go through its own revolution, where students and protesters tried to overthrow the communist government there in Hungary, but Stalin and Moscow would have nothing of it. Soviet troops went into Budapest, squashing the rebellion, and Eisenhower does not have the United States come to the aid of the anti-Soviet rebellion that took place in Hungary. So without outside support, the Hungarian Revolution was crushed by Soviet tanks. And the reason the United States gave is that we did not want a potential war with the Soviet Union in Europe. Cold War continuing, by 1953, Stalin dies. And President Eisenhower actually calls for a relaxation and a reduction in the arms race. And he calls this the Atoms for Peace plan was proposed. 1955, Eisenhower met with Soviet leaders in Geneva, known as the Spirit of Geneva. And this was, for all intents and purposes, the first look at a thaw in the Cold War. The new leader of the Soviet Union, his name was Nikita Khrushchev. And in a speech that he gave in 1956, he's also talking about how the two countries can peaceably coexist with one another. Okay? We had the Hungarian Revolution crushed. In 1957, I talked about in class how Russians beat us to space by launching the first space satellite known as Sputnik. So now the space race is on. So now there's new fear in the United States that we are technologically behind the Soviet Union when it comes to space. So NASA is founded, the National Aeronautic and Space Administration. The National Defense and Education Act was passed that provided more federal money to improve education and getting people to go into science and physics and things like that. Like I said, NASA is created, the space race is on, and then in 1960, in the middle of a summit, the U-2 spy plane incident took place, where the U-2 spy plane flown by this man, Francis Powers, was shot down over Russian airspace in Russian territory, and the United States denied that he was an American, and it was not a good look for the United States at all. During the Cold War, and even after World War II and the early Cold War, the world went through, especially in the developing world, went through a period of decolonization. This was the time in history, world history, where these countries that you see, these color-coded, all at one time were colonies of a larger empire, whether it be France, whether it be Britain, whether it be the United States, the Dutch, you name it. But after World War II, the collapse of colonial empires took place. And what this did is it led to both the United States and the Soviet Union competing for their influence in these developing countries. So that's why we see the Cold War spread and start in Europe. It's why we see it spread to Africa with these countries here, right? All of these countries were part of colonies, part of colonial empires at one time. And we also see it then spread to Asia, right? And also Latin America, which we don't see here on the map. The Cold War also would spread to the Middle East for fear of Soviet expansion, specifically to Iran. Eisenhower would use the CIA to undermine communist governments and install our own pro-U.S. governments in Iran and eventually in Guatemala in Latin America. In 1953, the United States CIA would help overthrow an elected Iranian government when it attempted to nationalize the Ford oil companies. Okay, the Shah of Iran comes to power. He would be very pro-West, pro-United States. He was a brutal dictator. He was a horrible leader, but he was good for the United States because he was anti-communist. Also in the Middle East emerged the Suez Canal crisis when President Nasser of Egypt tried to nationalize and take over the Suez Canal, which at the time was controlled by France and England. And as a response, England, France, and Israel attack Egypt, and the United States and Eisenhower has to get involved to basically mediate this crisis for fear of World War III, because the Soviets also threatened to get involved. The United States promised economic and military aid to any country in the Middle East that was threatened by communism. So much like what we were doing in other parts of the world, we would use the containment policy to try and contain communism in the Middle East as well. OPEC was formed. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries was formed in 1960. They are the oil cartel that has and occupies and owns, controls about 40 or 50% of the world's oil supply. The Cold War would spread to Latin America. I mentioned earlier it would spread to Guatemala. The CIA would help overthrow a democratically elected leader there in Guatemala. And we installed a brutal dictator. Why? Because he was anti-communist, right? By 1959, Cuba would fall to communism as well, when Fidel Castro would lead a revolution, removing the sitting leader, Batista, from power. So now Cuba is now communist. And Cuba, of course, this was of grave concern to the United States because it sits so close to Florida. Castro would nationalize America-owned businesses. In other words, he would take them over. They are now Cuba-controlled. And Eisenhower, in response, would order an embargo of Cuba. Cuba would move and gravitate more closely towards the communist camp in the Soviet Union. And Eisenhower, in response, would then initiate a plan to have CIA exiles be trained in the United States, in Louisiana and the southern part of the United States, to invade the Soviet Union, or to invade Cuba, to try and remove Castro from power. So when Eisenhower is leaving office, he gives a famous speech of his farewell address, and in that address he talks of what's called the military-industrial complex. And essentially that's a term that he used where he was referring to the United States was spending way too much money on the arms race, that it would have a negative impact on U.S. society. And he was talking about this marriage now between the military of the United States and defense industries in the United States. That there was a connection, and the money, the huge amounts of money that were being spent, is what's connecting them together. Okay? So one of the things you might be asked to do on a test, compare and contrast the Cold War successes and failures of Truman and President Eisenhower. That's a good thing to know. So for example, I called for the relaxation of tensions, right? Whereas Truman did not. Truman was more of hardline. Kennedy then, to finish off here, President Kennedy came into office in 1960. He defeated President Nixon. He was the first president to use TV and also debates, in the televised debates. He was the first Catholic president. His domestic program was known as the New Frontier, called for education, healthcare programs, civil rights. Most of his domestic agenda would be blocked by Congress and would be overshadowed by the concerns of foreign affairs. So Kennedy is the president who had to deal with Castro being in power, and eventually the Bay of Pigs invasion, but also the Cuban Missile Crisis as well, which we'll get to here momentarily. Kennedy also openly called for putting man on the moon as early as 1960 and 61, which of course we would do by 1969. And also in Cold War, the spirit of the Cold War, the Peace Corps was developed to create and send Americans to underdeveloped countries around the world, namely Asia, Africa, and Central America. By 1962, President Kennedy had to deal with Cuban missiles. The Soviets had placed missiles in Cuba. Spy planes that took photographs of Cuba discovered that the Soviets were installing offensive nuclear weapons that were capable of reaching any point you see here within the red circle. So what Kennedy does is he orders a naval blockade of Cuba. He calls it a quarantine because by calling it a blockade, that would have been an act of war. And he puts pressure on the Soviets to remove those missiles. This was the closest the world has ever been to nuclear war, World War III. What if the Soviets run the blockade? Advisors told JFK to attack Cuba, some did, before the missiles could become operational. In the end, Khrushchev, over a 2-week period, agrees to remove the missiles, and he does so if the United States promises not to invade Cuba and if we remove our missiles that we had pointing at the Soviet Union from bases in Turkey. What was the impact on this? This was the first time now that an actual hotline communication between Washington and Moscow was put in place, and there was a much greater effort to relax the hostilities between the two superpowers. The arms race would continue. The Kennedy administration would move away from Eisenhower's new look policy of massive retaliation and called more for a combination of both conventional weapons and nuclear weapons. Kennedy said the problem was that nuclear weapons could not be used in such small conflicts like Vietnam and Korea, whereas conventional weapons would be better. So he called for a combination of the two. He called this flexible response. So with the help of his defense secretary, you see here, Bob McNamara, they called for an increased spending on conventional weapons and also to maintain the nuclear arsenal of the United States. They also created in the U.S. military special forces known as the Green Beret. You've probably heard of them, and defense spending would continue to rise under Kennedy. Okay, so the rest of this PowerPoint involves things from chapter 26 and 27, so that's the end of the PowerPoint. That's the end of the notes. Again, go back, use this to your advantage. Take advantage of the lecture and chapter 25 material. I hope this has been helpful, and let me know if you have any questions. All right, thanks everybody. Bye for now.